was a stormy evening when I arrived at the old house on the edge of town. The sky was a roiling mass of dark clouds, punctuated by occasional flashes of lightning. The rain came down in heavy sheets, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. I had always been fascinated by the macabre, drawn to places steeped in history and mystery. So, when this old house, with its peeling paint and ivy-clad facade, became available, I couldn't resist. Little did I know, this house would offer more than just an escape from my mundane life. It would plunge me into a world of darkness and terror. As I stepped through the creaking front door, the silence inside was almost tangible. The air was cool and heavy, filled with the musty scent of disuse. The house was a jumble of old relics, faded photographs, antique furniture draped in sheets, and trinkets that seemed to whisper stories from a forgotten era. Amidst the clutter, one item stood out: a grand antique mirror hanging in the hallway. The mirror was imposing, framed in dark, intricately carved wood. Its glass was strange, almost unnaturally dark, as if it absorbed rather than reflected light. I found it intriguing and slightly unsettling. I attributed the oddity to the dust and age of the mirror, dismissing my unease as an overactive imagination. The first few weeks in the house were a blend of excitement and discomfort. I spent my days unpacking and exploring the vast, empty rooms. The garden was overgrown, a tangled mess of weeds and wildflowers that added to the house's aura of neglect. Despite the beauty of the surrounding landscape, a sense of dread lingered in the air. Strange occurrences began almost immediately. Objects would move on their own. A book would be out of place on a shelf, or a chair would be found in a different spot than where I had left it. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the corners of my vision. The mirror, which I had initially tried to ignore, became a focal point of my growing anxiety. I noticed that whenever I glanced at it, it seemed to distort light in a peculiar manner, making the hallway behind me appear darker and more foreboding. One evening, as I prepared dinner, I heard a faint rustling sound from the hallway. I assumed it was the house settling or perhaps a draft from an old window. But as I walked past the mirror, I saw something unsettling. The reflection seemed to ripple, as if the darkness within it were alive. My reflection was distorted, its edges blurred and darkened. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. As days turned into weeks, the unsettling feeling grew stronger. I began to experience vivid dreams, nightmares where I was trapped in an endless dark corridor, my only company the sound of my own echoing footsteps and distant, incoherent whispers. Each morning I awoke feeling as though I hadn't slept at all, my mind plagued by the lingering unease of the night. The mirror seemed to take on a life of its own. It wasn't just a passive object anymore. It felt like an active participant in my growing sense of dread. One night, while lying in bed, I heard the rustling again, but this time it was accompanied by a soft, rhythmic scratching sound. My heart raced as I got up to investigate, only to find the hallway dark and silent save for the mirror. It stood there, its surface now obscured by a thick black fog that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I approached the mirror, my breath coming in shallow gasps. As I touched the glass, I felt a cold, almost electric sensation. The fog cleared for a moment, revealing my reflection, only it wasn't quite right. The face staring back at me had hollow eyes and a twisted, mocking grin. I recoiled, stumbling back to my room, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Determined to understand what was happening, I started to research the mirror's history. I discovered it was an antique from the early 19th century, known for its rumored ability to trap souls and reflect not just images, but the deepest fears of those who gazed into it. The more I read, the more I realized that the mirror was not just a relic, but a gateway to something far more sinister. My research led me to old tales and folklore about mirrors as portals to other realms, often associated with curses and dark forces. It became clear that the mirror was not merely an object of beauty, but a conduit for something malevolent. The face I had seen in the reflection was not just a figment of my imagination, but a trapped soul. Much like myself, the house continued to reveal its dark nature. Whispers grew louder, becoming more coherent and insistent. They seemed to come from the mirror, a constant low murmur that spoke of secrets and promises. I could no longer ignore the fact that the mirror was affecting my mental state. It felt like a constant presence, one that was growing increasingly malevolent. I began to experience more intense and vivid dreams. In these nightmares, I found myself walking through dark, shadowy landscapes, each more twisted and surreal than the last. The whispers in my dreams became clearer, speaking of a curse and a trap. I woke up each morning with a sense of dread that clung to me like a shroud. One day, while exploring the attic, I came across a box of old letters and documents. They seemed to belong to the previous occupants of the house. As I sifted through them, I found a letter that stood out. It was a frantic scrawl, written in a hand that was clearly shaking. The letter spoke of a mirror that held a dark power, a cursed object that had driven its owner to madness. The more I read, the more I realized that the mirror was not just a passive observer, but an active participant in the house's dark history. Desperate to end the torment, I sought out information about rituals and methods to break curses associated with mirrors. I discovered that breaking such a curse required not only a physical act, but also a profound spiritual effort. Armed with this knowledge, I prepared for a confrontation with the dark force residing within the mirror. The night I performed the ritual was stormy, with lightning flashing across the sky and the wind howling through the trees. I drew symbols around the mirror using chalk and recited incantations from old texts I had found. The atmosphere in the house grew oppressive, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. As I completed the ritual, the mirror's surface began to ripple violently as if resisting my efforts. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. The dark figure that emerged from the broken glass was a nightmarish version of myself, filled with rage and despair. It writhed and struggled as if trying to escape the confines of the mirror. The sight was both horrifying and tragic, a reflection of the darkest parts of my own soul. In the aftermath of the ritual, the house fell eerily silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted and the air seemed to clear. The mirror was gone, its shards scattered across the floor. I felt a profound sense of relief mixed with an overwhelming sense of loss. The house, once a place of dread, now seemed almost peaceful. Yet the experience had changed me irrevocably. I moved out of the house, leaving behind the remnants of the mirror and the memories of the terror it had wrought. The house was eventually sold, and the new owners seemed blissfully unaware of its dark history. I hoped that the mirror's curse had been broken, and that the house could finally be free of its malevolent influence. Years later, while walking past a secondhand store, I saw a familiar sight, a grand antique mirror with an ornate frame. My heart skipped a beat and a cold shiver ran down my spine. The mirror was identical to the one that had haunted me. I felt an inexplicable pull towards it as if it was calling me. Unable to resist, I approached the mirror. As I gazed into its surface, I saw a reflection that was not entirely my own. The shadowy grin and piercing eyes were unmistakable. I turned away quickly, my mind racing with memories of the house and the mirror's sinister presence. Leaving the store, I felt a profound sense of unease. I knew that some reflections are better left unseen, and that the mirror, with its dark promise, had waited for me all along. The experience had taught me that some secrets are best left buried, and some reflections are too dangerous to confront. It started as a routine journey. I had just accepted a new job in a town a few hours away, and the road stretched out before me like a promise of new beginnings. The weather was clear, the sun was shining, and I was filled with a sense of optimistic anticipation. I packed up my car with essentials, said a quick goodbye to my old life, and set off, eager to embrace this new chapter. The route was a well-traveled highway that I had driven countless times before. As I settled into my seat and put on my favorite playlist, I felt a sense of calm and excitement. The journey seemed straightforward enough, just a long stretch of road through quiet countryside, with the occasional town dotting the horizon. As I drove through the rural landscape, the scenery gradually changed. The open fields and small farms gave way to denser woods and winding roads. The sunlight filtering through the trees created shifting patterns on the asphalt, and I found myself lost in thought. Everything seemed normal until I noticed the first sign of something amiss. An old, weathered billboard advertising a now-defunct business. The paint was peeling, and the text was barely legible. It seemed oddly out of place in an otherwise picturesque setting. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the quirks of rural travel. But as the miles passed, I began to notice more unusual signs. Rusty road markers, faded graffiti on overgrown road signs, and strange symbols carved into trees. They were subtle, but they began to gnaw at the edges of my consciousness, making me uneasy. Several hours into the drive, I came across a junction that wasn't marked on my map. The road split into two paths, each lined with dense, dark forest. A small, handwritten sign indicated that the road to the left led to a scenic overlook, while the road to the right continued toward my destination. Feeling adventurous, I took the left turn, thinking I could enjoy a quick detour and some fresh air. The road to the overlook was narrow and winding, flanked by towering trees that seemed to close in around me. The daylight dimmed as the trees thickened, casting long, dark shadows across the road. The air grew colder, and the sound of the wind rustling through the branches created an eerie symphony. I felt a twinge of apprehension, but pressed on, hoping to reach the overlook and enjoy the view. As I rounded a bend, the road seemed to vanish into thin air. I found myself in a small clearing with no visible exit, just a dense wall of trees. The GPS on my phone had lost signal, and the car's radio, which had been playing my favorite tunes, crackled with static. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant call of a bird. I decided to turn around and retrace my steps, but the road I had taken seemed to have disappeared. No matter how far I drove, I couldn't find the way back. I drove in circles, growing more anxious with each passing minute. The trees loomed closer, their branches clawing at the sides of my car. Just when I was about to panic, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. A tall, thin man with a weather-beaten face and a worn-out coat. He was holding a flashlight and waving it in a peculiar pattern. Desperate for help, I pulled over and rolled down the window. The man approached the car, his eyes hidden in the shadow of his hat. "Lost, are you?" he asked in a gravelly voice. I explained my situation, and he nodded slowly, saying he could help me find my way back. Reluctantly, I followed him, my nerves frayed by the strange encounter. He led me through a series of twisting paths and narrow roads, each more confusing than the last. As we drove, he spoke of the local legends, stories of travelers who had vanished, of roads that led to nowhere. His words, though seemingly casual, sent a chill down my spine. Eventually, we reached a familiar road, and I thanked the stranger profusely. He simply tipped his hat and vanished into the woods without a word. As I continued on my way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the familiar landmarks disappearing one by one. I tried to call for help, but my phone was dead despite having had a full charge earlier. The radio played nothing but static, and my GPS was completely unreliable. It felt as though I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, with no way to escape. The landscape around me grew darker and more foreboding. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The road became a narrow, twisting path with sharp turns and sudden drops. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and I could no longer tell if I was driving in circles or making any progress at all. The road seemed to grow more twisted and sinister as I continued. My anxiety mounted with every mile, and the sense of being followed became overwhelming. Shadows danced on the edges of my vision, and strange noises, scratching, whispering, and occasional dissonant laughter, filled the car. I tried to call for help, but my phone was dead, despite having had a full charge earlier. The radio played nothing but static, and my GPS was completely unreliable. It felt as though I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, with no way to escape. The landscape around me grew darker and more foreboding. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The road became a narrow, twisting path with sharp turns and sudden drops. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and I could no longer tell if I was driving in circles or making any progress at all. By the early hours of the morning, exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. My eyes were heavy and my mind was foggy. The oppressive darkness outside seemed to seep into the car, making every sound and shadow seem more menacing. The temperature inside the car dropped sharply, and I could see my breath fogging up the windshield. In my half-awake state, I began to see strange visions. Faces appeared in the trees, their eyes watching me with a cold, detached gaze. I heard voices, soft, mournful whispers that seemed to come from all directions. The car's interior felt like a cocoon of fear, trapping me in an ever-tightening grip. I fought to stay awake, but the road seemed endless, and my mind was slipping into delirium. I saw flickering lights in the distance, which I hoped were signs of civilization. Desperately, I pushed on, hoping to reach whatever lay beyond the darkness. Eventually, I reached a large, imposing gate that seemed to come out of nowhere. It was old and rusted, with intricate wrought iron designs that twisted and turned in eerie patterns. The gate was partially open, as if inviting me in. Beyond it lay a sprawling estate, shrouded in mist and shadow. I drove through the gate, hoping to find help or at least some respite from the madness. The estate was grand but abandoned, with overgrown gardens and crumbling walls. I parked the car and ventured out, drawn by a sense of eerie familiarity. The house was large, with tall, dark windows that seemed to watch me as I approached. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with dust and decay. The house felt like a relic from another time, its grandeur long faded. I wandered through the rooms, each more dilapidated than the last. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. As I explored, I found a room at the back of the house with an old ornate mirror hanging on the wall. It was identical to the one I had seen at the gas station. My heart raced as I approached it, the mirror's dark surface reflecting not just my image but something more unsettling.